40 here. So I've just finished reading the new Philip Roth biography by Blake Bailey, and it's terrific. So it's about 700 pages. Everything you've ever wanted to know about Philip Roth, you can find in this book. You find about all the people who inspired his novels, how he transformed reality into fiction. And you'll notice with Roth's most successful books that they involved a lot more than just introspection. Okay, so a lot of Roth's work was highly repetitive. He would just essentially write out his masturbatory fantasies and write about his own problems. And there wasn't a big demand for that, but when he based his work on research, on what was going on in the wider world, then when Roth helped us to better understand reality, then there was a huge market for that. So, for example, Philip Roth helped to predict 9/11. So in a book he published, I think in the year 2000, The Dying Animal, it was about the professor of desire, David Kepesh. He wrote, "Brilliance flaring across the time zones of the millennial New Year's Eve celebration, and none ignited by bin Laden." So Philip Roth saw that bin Laden was on a jihad. Brilliance flaring across the time zones and none ignited by bin Laden. So that was Philip Roth's eerie prediction of 9/11. So great fiction can help us better understand the world around us. And I think the number one writer in this capacity was Tom Wolfe. I just love his journalism. I love his fiction. I think he was an absolute giant. And his writing technique, whether it was nonfiction or fiction, depended upon four elements. So abundant use of realistic dialogue. Second, paying close attention to status details. So Roth saw people as largely motivated by trying to avoid humiliation and to gain in status. Then scene-by-scene construction. So Tom Wolfe would write scenes so that each scene would have a beginning, middle, and end. So that's the most satisfying way to read about something, is to have scenes with a beginning, middle, and end. And then Wolfe would use multiple points of view. So he'd get inside the heads of the various characters. So that's a compelling recipe, whether it's for nonfiction or for fiction. And Tom Wolfe wrote his literary manifesto in a long essay for Harper's Magazine in 1989 called "Stalking the Billion-Footed Beast," a literary manifesto for the new social novel. And this is brilliant because the things he's saying apply just as much for writing compelling nonfiction as for writing compelling fiction, and in large part to do compelling live streams. So I can do a live stream and all I do is talk about myself. Now, that will be compelling and interesting only to the extent that it helps you better understand yourself. All right, so when I connect with you, then that's compelling and interesting. If I'm not connected with you, then it's boring. So I remember I took a media class in high school, and there was one day that I prepared like 8 hours for my presentation, and the whole class just tuned out within about 30 seconds. And then there are other days when I only put in 30 minutes or an hour for my presentation, but I wanted to connect. And so I was taking my cues from the audience. I was allowing them to affect me as I was affecting them. And then the whole class was tuned in. So it was a fascinating experience to see I could do all this preparation, but if I wasn't interested in connection, it wasn't working. So, literary manifesto for the new social novel by Tom Wolfe. He starts, "May I be forgiven if I take as my text the 6th page of the 4th chapter of The Bonfire of the Vanities." So this is a great Tom Wolfe novel set in New York City of the 1980s. And Tom Wolfe's work better helps you understand the world around you, just like reading Middlemarch by George Eliot. It better helps you understand yourself and the world around you. So the protagonist of the Bonfire of the Vanities is Sherman McCoy, and he is a bond trader on Wall Street. He's driving over the Triborough Bridge in New York City in his Mercedes Roadster with his 26-year-old girlfriend, not his 40-year-old wife. And she's in the tan leather bucket seat beside him. And he's glancing triumphantly off to his left toward the island of Manhattan. And the towers were jammed together so tightly he could feel the mass and the stupendous weight. Just think of the millions from all over the globe who yearned to be on that island, in those towers, in those narrow streets. There it was, the Rome, the Paris, the London of the 20th century, the city of ambition, the dense magnetic rock, the irresistible destination of all those who insist on being where things are happening. So that's what makes a compelling live stream, a compelling piece of nonfiction, a compelling piece of fiction, is that it takes you to where you feel like things are happening, whether it's things that are happening in your own soul, in your own work situation, in your own life, or in the greater world around you, where the future is being created, right? We all want to go to the middle of where things are happening. And I've been listening to a terrific Audible series that really helps effective communication skills by Dalton Kehoe. So whenever I need to take a break.
So she says to herself, smoking isn't really so harmful. Why, I had an aunt who smoked until she died at 92. Or, smoking is worth the risk because it helps me relax or prevents me from gaining weight, and after all, that's a health risk too, and so on. In fact, the drive for consistency, also called the drive for consonance, between our perceptions of ourselves and our behavior is so important that we'll go out of our way to claim supportive evidence as well-researched and arguments in favor of our ideas as well taken and
right. So this is how it works. When I see supporting evidence for my ideas, I'll tell you, oh, this is well-researched, mate. This is peer-reviewed. This is solid stuff. This isn't like a comic book version of reality. Like the research that supports my opinions, this is solid. This is real stuff. But the research that supports your opinions, oh, it's a bit dicey, mate.
Important, while dismissing as contradictory arguments as stupid, poorly researched, and based on rare occurrences. You can see this being played out in the media on major issues all the time by people who've taken different views of the world. This effect is so pervasive that social psychologists call it the confirmation bias. We see what we need to see to be internally consistent. So, for example, if you believe you are a capable, kindly, and attentive spouse, and your mate criticizes you for being...
Yeah, we see what we need to see so that we can feel internally consistent. So in other words, we ignore everything that contradicts our own sense of ourselves and our own sense of how the world works. So you probably had the experience of dealing with people who are just unable to accept reality, right? They just have these very strong visions for how the world should work, and anything that contradicts their vision for how the world should work, they just ignore, right? These people are quite annoying, but to some extent, we're like them. We all tend to contradict and to ignore anything that is not in consonance with who we think we are and how we see in the world. So I'm reading this biography of Saul Bellow by James Atlas. It came out, I think, in the year 2000, and so much reminds me of myself. It's embarrassing. So I was terribly prone to jealousy when I was a teenager, when I was first falling in love. And when this girl I liked, she talked about going to a Journey concert with some college guy, I just cut her off. And I just stopped answering her letters because I was just so insanely jealous. I would get a girlfriend, and then if I saw her, hanging out with another guy, I'd just get really angry because I was so insecure. So Bellow, a biography by James Atlas. I have not enjoyed Saul Bellow's work. I did read Ravelstein. I think that's the only novel of his I've been able to finish. But as I'm reading about Saul Bellow, it reminds me so much of myself. Sickly child, yeah, that's how I grew up, sickly child. He was his mother's favorite. She treated him like an invalid. So I remember when I was a kid, my parents would tell me that my mother had a vision that I would grow up to do amazing things for God. So a lot of great writers and high achievers in the public sphere, our presidents often seem to come from homes where they were adored by their mothers and ignored by their fathers. So Saul Bellow was the designated nostalgia man in his family. He was the keeper of warm memories. His brothers were aggressive and practical. So this is like me. I'm the designated nostalgia man. My siblings are much more practical than me. The heroes of all of Saul Bellow's books are all versions of Saul Bellow. Okay, so it's not surprising that many writers tend out to be quite narcissistic. The reason that we make live streams and that we write blog posts or we produce books is that we want to hear appreciation, that we want to hear adoration, that we want to be, liked and loved and respected. So the heroes of all Saul Bellow's books were him, like variously depicted as a dreamer or as bookish, head in the clouds, intellectual, or a confused soul in need of guidance. So he had two brothers who were quite worldly successful, and they kind of looked after him. Saul Bellow grew up in Montreal, and they would speak, like, French was the dominant language, but they'd also speak English in school. They'd speak Yiddish at home. They grew up literate in several different languages. We read British books and sang God Save the Queen and recited the Lord's Prayer. So I so identify with this in my teenage years. He romanticized relationships. So I would read more into my relationships with girls than was really there. And so Saul Bellow would, when he'd write about his teenage relationships, he'd romanticize them. He would cast them as all sweetness and light. But in reality, Saul Bellow, like me, he was quite erratic in his constancy. He was greedy for attention. Like, girls would leave me for the weekend, just absolutely exhausted because I just sucked them dry for all the attention and nurturing that I could get. My therapist said she pictured me as a little boy who would just suckle on a mother's breast, so greedily because he was afraid that the milk would run dry. So Saul Bellow grew up greedy for attention and fiercely jealous. So that greed for attention was much of the fuel for his writing. He noticed this girl he liked was wearing the fraternity pin of a basketball player, and he grabbed it and tore it off her and ripped her blouse. And she remembers, I was afraid of the guy. And this scene finds its way into his novel Humboldt's Gift. May we never forget Saul Bellow. There was such a vibrant Jewish community at Humboldt Park in Chicago. That "You're a violent kid," his high school girlfriend recalls. "You almost choked me to death because I went to a dance with some basketball player." So in high school, there was this girl I liked, and she went to the senior prom with this basketball player. And I was so jealous that I spread all these nasty rumors about her afterwards, that she and this guy had had massive sex. So Saul Bellow lost his mother when he was about 12. I lost my mother when I was 3. And so it left Saul Bellow forever mother-bound. Like, it was a bondage that he played out in 5 separate marriages and a string of failed relationships. He was never able to free himself of the intensity of his need for a mother. Saul Bellow, like myself, like most writers, had this strong self-dramatizing impulse. And it grew out of this need to make himself heard. So I'd often complain at home, "You're not listening to me." And my stepmother related that to a friend of the family, and the friend said, "Oh, Luke just needs 500 people paying attention to him. And if he were at UCLA, he'd have that right now, but he's a wounded young god." To Saul Bellow's siblings, he would always be the baby of the family. So I'm 54, but I'm still the baby of the family because my siblings are 8 and 11 years older than me, and conventionally much more successful than myself. So Saul Bellow worked for his brother Maurice, but his brother fired him because Saul Bellow would keep reading on the job. Saul Bellow got quite discouraged by his teacher's failure to recognize his promise. He wanted their attention. So Saul Bellow started out at the University of Chicago, one of America's elite universities, but he could no longer afford the fees. So he transferred to Northwestern. It was a good school, but it couldn't compete with the University of Chicago. So initially, Saul Bellow just wanted to deny that he'd ever gone to Northwestern because it wasn't particularly prestigious. But as his fame grew, he began to look more favorably upon Northwestern. He became almost defiant. It was less prestigious, but the teachers there, they showed greater appreciation of his talent. So for attention-hungry people like myself and Saul Bellow, we go to where the attention is. We grow towards attention like plants grow towards the light. Northwestern was in some ways more elitist than Chicago's. So until about the 1960s, English literature departments in the United States were dominated by Anglo-Saxons in particular. So it was regarded as a career for gentlemen. And so the English departments would tend to be dominated by the new critics, the Southern agrarians, for whom all literature was English. So university English departments, until about the 1960s, were under the vigilant protection of the Anglo-Saxon tradition. And you didn't have Jews getting tenure teaching English literature in the United States until Lionel Trilling, I think, in 1939. But there were no such restrictions in anthropology. So Saul Bellow was discouraged from studying English literature on a graduate level. So he went to seek out advice from the chairman of the English department, who told him, "You've got a very good record, but I would not recommend you study English. You weren't born to it." No Jew could really grasp the tradition of English literature, the chairman explained. No Jew would ever have the right feeling for it. And that makes a certain sense, because the history of English literature is really the history of Christianity. Okay, English literature is primarily shaped by Christianity. So bringing Jews into the study and the teaching of English literature is bringing in outsiders. So University of Chicago did not discriminate against Jews as much as the Ivy Leagues in the early part of the 20th century. So there was a joke about the University of Chicago that it was composed of Jewish professors teaching Roman Catholicism, really meaning the great books, like from Thomas Aquinas to Augustine to Protestants. So Jewish professors teaching Roman Catholicism to Protestants. That's the old joke about the University of Chicago. Anthropology was regarded as like the most far-out academic pursuit. And so a lot of Jews went into anthropology. They weren't generally welcome to the field of English literature. So anthropology was for people who wanted to criticize society. Like radicalism was implicit in anthropology, especially sexual radicalism. So physical anthropology had been overtaken by cultural anthropology early in the 20th century, with the denial that there were real differences between races. So anthropology gave young Jews a greater sense of freedom from surrounding restrictions. They were seeking immunity from the Anglo-Saxon custom. They didn't worry about being accepted or rejected by a society of Christian gentlemen, unlike the field of English literature. So anthropology, the study of foreign cultures, provided expression for Saul Bellow's own sense of exclusion from American society. There was a condition that haunted him his whole life, even after he became an exemplary and deeply assimilated spokesman for all the opportunities that the United States offered. But like many Jewish intellectuals of his generation, so Saul Bellow was born around 1900, he never got rid of the suspicion that he wasn't quite part of America, because America, the United States of America, was founded by people from England and the United Kingdom. So they made up about 85-90% of the population at the time of the War of Independence. All the founding institutions of the United States of America are Anglo-Saxon. So it makes sense that Jewish immigrants, particularly first-generation Jewish immigrants, would not feel necessarily a strong part of things. So Tom Wolfe wrote the great novel about New York in the 1980s, The Bonfire of the Vanities. And so for Wolfe, the idea of writing a novel about this astonishing metropolis, a big novel, he wanted to cram as much of New York City between the covers as he could. This was the most tempting, the most challenging, the most obvious idea an American writer could possibly have. Wolfe first tried this approach in 1968, but what he had in mind then was what he called a non-fiction novel. He'd just written the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test about the psychedelic and hippie movement, and he began to indulge in some speculations about non-fiction as an art form, and he records these speculations in a terrific anthology called The New Journalism. So he talks about the 4 essential elements for creating compelling journalism, which are the same 4 essential elements that he uses for creating fiction. Abundant use of realistic dialogue, pay very close attention to status details, multiple points of view, and scene-by-scene construction. So Tom Wolfe in the 1960s, alone in his little apartment on East 58th Street, was worried that there'd be someone out there who'd write a big, realistic, fictional novel about the hippie experience that would blow the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test out of the water. Somebody, there might be droves of them. Among the hippies were many well-educated, creative people, but the years went by and none of those novels ever appeared. And Wolfe writes in 1989, to this day they remain unwritten. So Wolfe turned to his proposed non-fiction novel about New York City. He thought this book should be a novel of the city, take people where things are happening. We all want to be where the action is. That's one of the reasons I got so excited about a career in journalism, that it put me right in the middle of things. So Balzac and Zola had written novels about Paris. Dickens and Thackeray had written novels of London. The city was always in the foreground, exerting its relentless pressure on the souls of its inhabitants. So where we place ourselves has a tremendous effect on us. Even the architecture in our lives affects us. Other people affect us. The weather affects us. We are all influenced by our context. So in the 1960s, we had certain powerful forces that were converging. You had the economic boom that began in the middle of the Second World War, and it surged into the 60s without even a mild recession. So these prosperous times created a sense of immunity, so that standards that had been in place for millennia were just swept aside. You got the sexual revolution, which is a rather prim term, Tom Wolfe notes, for the lurid carnival that took place. And the boom of prosperity also triggered something else, overt racial conflict. Like bad feelings between races, all right, those are always with us. But they'd been rumbling on low boil in America's cities ever since the great migrations from the rural South began in the 1920s. But you had to have certain conditions that allowed these bad feelings to become overt. So with Black Lives Matter, we've encouraged certain segments of the population to feel aggrieved and that they should get out and protest. So I was looking at the Twitter feed of my friend Monica Osborne, and she just tweeted, apparently a big riot and loot fest is being planned for Los Angeles. I'm looking forward to seeing my friends who say violence is necessary, looking forward to seeing my friends set fire to their own multi-million-dollar homes and throw their Gucci into the streets. You gotta walk the walk. So, not sure when this big riot and loot fest is coming for Los Angeles. Not sure if I'm looking forward to the summer of DeAndre, the dude that woman cop shot in Minnesota, right? She thought she was reaching for a taser. Apparently the guy that she shot wasn't such a righteous man after all. So Dante Wright had a warrant out for his arrest for attempted aggravated robbery charges after choking and holding a woman at gunpoint for $820 in 2019. So you don't want to get into fights with people who have guns, such as the police. And when you create confrontations, people's range for rational thinking starts to diminish as you're under pressure. So she thought she was reaching for a taser, but she was actually reached for a gun, and she shot the guy. But he played a tremendous role in that by creating a very tense situation. So he was shot and killed by police officer Kimberly Potter in Minnesota on Sunday, leading to days of unrest. So in 1965, we had a whole series of race riots erupt. And it wasn't just because of some negative feelings on the down low between various racial groups. These riots moved to Detroit in 1967. They peaked in Washington and Chicago in 1968. Tom Wolfe says these were riots that only the 60s could have produced. Just as there were social conditions, the late Obama-era collapse produced Black Lives Matter, which then created the reaction of America voting in Donald Trump, which then created a reaction which led us to Joe Biden and the current moment. In the 60s, the federal government created the War on Poverty, at the heart of which were not arms for the poor, but setups called CAPs, Community Action Programs. Community action programs were something new in the history of political science. They were official invitations from the government to people in the slums to improve their lot by rising up and rebelling against the establishment, including the government itself. So Black Lives Matter, these race riots, these wild Antifa protests, they've been incentivized by our elites. Most of our major corporations, for example, have donated to the domestic terror group Black Lives Matter. So the government provided the money, the headquarters, and the advisors, so the people in the slums obliged. The riots were merely the most sensational form the strategy took. A more customary form was the confrontation. Confrontation was a 60s term, and we're still living in the 60s in this era. It was not by mere coincidence that the most violent of the 60s confrontational groups, the Black Panther Party of America, drew up its 10-point program in the North Oakland Poverty Center, a poverty center funded by the government. That's what the Poverty Center was there for, essentially to encourage rioting and confrontation. Such was the backdrop one day in January of 1970 when I decided to attend a party that Leonard Bernstein and his wife Felicia were giving for the Black Panthers in their apartment at Park Avenue and 79th Street. So Black Panthers were among the most famous manifestations of Black nationalism. So many Blacks have not felt part of the American project, so they developed their own nationalism. Just as many Jews have not felt part of the national project of the Gentile countries they were part of, so if they became particularly nationalistic, then they'd become Zionist. Zionism is an expression of Jewish nationalism. Wolfe thought there might be material for a chapter in my nonfiction Vanity Fair type novel about New York. I didn't know the half of it. It was at this party that a Black Panther field marshal rose up beside the North piano. There was also a South piano in Leonard Bernstein's living room, and he outlined the Black Panthers' 10-point program to a room full of socialites and celebrities who entertained a vision of the future in which, after the revolution, there would no longer be any such thing as a 2-story, 13-room apartment on Park Avenue with twin grand pianos in the living room, all for just one family. So all I was after was material for a chapter in a nonfiction novel, but the party was such a perfect set piece that I could not hold back, writes Tom Wolfe. I read an account of the evening for New York Magazine called Radical Chic. There's a companion piece, an article about the confrontations the War on Poverty had spawned in San Francisco, Mau Mauing the Flak Catchers. Two were published as a book in the fall of 1970. Once again, I braced and waited for the big, realistic novels that were sure to be written about this phenomenon that had played such a major part in American life in the 1960s and early 1970s, racial strife in the cities. Once again, the years rolled by and these novels never appeared. So if you read the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, there's a lot of intelligent, useful commentary in there, but overall, any connection between the truth and what's being reported in these publications is incidental. So there aren't multiple points of view in these publications. There's only one set point of view, generally speaking, on Black Lives Matter, on racial protest. There's only one acceptable point of view in the mainstream media, and that is Black people have every reason to be furious at white people, right? And so the news media stokes the rage. The news media tells them that the cops are racist, that the government is racist, that our society is racist. And so the news media, many of our elites in the academy, they're just giving one point of view. They're not entering into the points of view of the other characters, such as Asians, Latinos, and whites. It's just one dominant ethos that the news media pushes on us. It's like a comic book version of reality, that blacks are only oppressed, that they're, as Steve Saylor notes, they are above criticism and they are beneath agency. That's the point of view that the news media wants to push. And so where a great novel can come in is that it can give you multiple points of view. You can feel things intensely from various perspectives, with close attention to status detail, close attention to realistic dialogue. So you don't get a lot of realistic dialogue in the mainstream media. Instead, you get quotations that tend to be heavily sanitized. But when you pick up a great book, like, I often get the feeling, this is real life, right? I'm not getting a sanitized, watered down version of reality. That's what a great book can do.
Incompetent, cruel, and dismissive, you might ignore or distort the message one way or another, huh? What do you think? Either you attribute the message to the fact that your mate might be just having a bad day, or you might decide that they're playing some kind of odd joke on you. The idea is to maintain your consistent views of yourself and your behavior. Now, this process is also supported by the unconscious operations of the mind as well. A group of people were having their brains scanned using magnetic resonance imaging while receiving critical information about their favorite presidential candidates. The scans indicated that the reasoning areas of the brain, frontal lobes, virtually shut down when this dissonant information was being delivered. But when consciousness was restored, when they got information that fit their perceptions, by telling them, of course, that the first information was actually a lie, it was fabricated, the emotion circuits of the brain lit up happily. I guess it's hard to change your mind. And it is. Unless you can get someone to do something they wouldn't ordinarily do, then a change can happen.
Okay, let's carry on this another time.